Our story begins with someone running, and it was none other than our protagonist who declared they were running late. At that moment, two people noticed that King Duan had arrived, and immediately started complaining about the delay. However, King Jin pointed out that he also used to arrive late after arriving. The protagonist apologized for being late, and here are some details about him. He is a supportive rank, and his name is Sinjonio. Continuing, Kim Duan declared he was just joking, while Kim Jim explained that Chanu and Dun were already inside. However, our protagonist admitted that things weren't going well. It had been 3 months since he joined that guild, and in his first dungeon raid, he was already running late as they approached the portal. The protagonist thought he needed to pull himself together, since this was his first raid in a dungeon as support. Besides, he felt the need to prove he was useful. At that moment, someone arrived. It was none other than Mundone, who asked if it was his first dungeon. The protagonist confirmed, explaining it was his first time as support. However, he had been in a dungeon before as an assistant. Don then explained that supports don't have combat skills like hunters, so he needed to be careful. Besides, there was a risk of being dragged into the fight if he got too close. If he stayed too far, they wouldn't be able to defend him. So maintaining a good distance was essential. He clarified that as a creator, he only needed to stay at a safe distance and craft a dagger for him when it was called for. Then Moondone asked if he understood, to which the protagonist replied yes, that was all he needed to do, which Moondone agreed with, since he was the only one who needed extra weapons. He explained it was an easy dungeon, so there was no need to over-prepare. However, Leijin commented that he could sense mana, which meant there was a monster nearby at that moment. Their group began to prepare for battle, following their formation. Moondone asked Link if he had any observations, and he reported detecting 3 small sources of mana and 1 large enough to be a boss. Upon hearing this, Moondone found it strange since a boss normally doesn't leave its designated area. He then declared he would handle the boss while the others dealt with the rest. Then Moondone asked how long it would take to create a dagger, and the protagonist replied it would take 20 seconds but would last less than a minute. However, Moondone considered that ideal, and instructed the protagonist to start making them immediately, declaring that he would finish the fight in 40 seconds. At that moment, crystal lizards appeared, classified as difficulty rank Kim. Duan declared he was starting, activating his ability, and sent the lizards flying. Kim Jim stepped forward, prepared his fist, and struck a lizard. After landing the blow, he quickly stepped back, striking an elegant pose. However, the other crystal lizards advanced towards Kim. Jin was surprised to see how quickly they regenerated and warned everyone to be careful as 2 were heading towards her. Kim Duan then asked about the spell, and Link confirmed it was almost ready. A moment later, Link cast his spell, shooting multiple fireballs that caused a massive explosion. Link confirmed everything was okay, and Kim Duan then ordered them to assist. Meanwhile, the protagonist observed everything and commented that it was an excellent sequence of attacks. However, Moon Duan asked about the weapons. The protagonist confirmed they were almost ready, reminding himself not to get distracted and to focus. After a short time, our protagonist used his basic creator ability, creating a rank F item using mana to forge objects. At that moment, the protagonist threw a sword to Mundone. He quickly caught it and used his shadow weapon ability to enhance it, improving its overall quality. Meanwhile, the crystal lizard launched itself at him, and effortlessly, he sliced the monster. After that attack, the protagonist's creation disappeared. Kim Duan asked if anyone was hurt, and Kim Jin confirmed he was fine. Seeing all this, the protagonist admitted it was a much better guild than he expected. Moreover, each of them was remarkable. Their teamwork avoided any mistakes in battle. He concluded that if they kept this up, they would become a great guild. However, on the other hand, he declared that he hadn't done anything except create the dagger. Aside from that, he wasn't very useful. He even questioned whether he deserved to be with them. But then Mundone approached and asked if the protagonist was hurt. He declared he wasn't. However, he explained that he hadn't been truly useful. Despite this, Moonduan told him that he had saved a lot of money thanks to his ability, since, as he had seen before, his ability consumed weapons. Moreover, he couldn't keep doing that even if he used a cheap dagger. That's why he needed a creator like the protagonist, since his ability worked with any weapon that contained mana. Then he declared, once again, that he had done a good job on his first mission in the dungeon. He told him to keep it up and not stray from them, to which he responded he would give his best. At that moment, Kim Duan declared they needed to gather the loot and leave. However, the whole environment trembled. Kim Jin even wondered if an earthquake was happening, and Link asked if the cave was collapsing because they had killed the boss. Pointing with his finger, the protagonist asked them to look over there. He explained that the wall was crumbling. However, Link cast a spell on his staff and explained that there was something like a passage and declared that it must be connected to somewhere while Montoya was not thinking. Kim Duan, he couldn't stay still and declared it was a secret passage, also explaining there was probably hidden treasure, and he urged Kim to go. Jin also agreed with this. However, Lin stated they couldn't enter. But then Moon Doan asked if Lin could detect anything, to which he replied no. With that, Mondo saw no problem and asked them to be quick. Seeing the situation, Link also agreed to go. Then Mondo called our protagonist, however, a moment after entering. Our protagonist was running from a monster, explaining that everyone was dead except him, and said a monster like that shouldn't be in a low-rank dungeon. Besides, he had never heard of a monster that couldn't be detected by magic. As he turned, the protagonist realized the monster had caught up to him. Then the monster hit him, sending him flying. He hit the ground, coughing up blood. The protagonist declared he needed to get up because he couldn't die like this. Then he conjured something, created a dagger, and threw it at the monster. But it had no effect, and the monster attacked fiercely, breaking the ground, causing him to fall. As he fell, the protagonist felt anxious about the situation. He declared he was a useless, low-rank support, unable to use simple things like healing or buffing skills. Moreover, when he finally found a guild that really needed him, he abandoned them only to be killed anyway, he explained, that anyone in his place would have done better. At that moment, he declared he should have never awakened. However, the system notified him that he had found something, but it was censored. Moreover, he had met the requirements to become a player. Upon opening his eyes, a bright light appeared, and so the system welcomed him. After a while, our protagonist opened his eyes, and the system declared there was a new reward for him. However, our protagonist didn't understand anything, even though he didn't comprehend what was happening. He opened his hand and pressed the system button. After some time, our protagonist returned to the place where he had fallen. The system informed him that he would inherit the experience from his previous save. Meanwhile, the crystal grumbled. However, the system announced that the reward distribution had finished. Then our protagonist threw several swords at the monster, causing it to fall to the ground. On the other hand, our protagonist was lost in his thoughts, as unknown memories had been placed in his mind, but with no time to think too much. The monster advanced towards him again. At the last second, our protagonist managed to conjure some kind of barrier. The protagonist was surprised to see that the monster had taken no damage. Despite being a golem-type monster, it had formidable durability. After his barrier was destroyed, the protagonist declared that if the information from those memories was correct, even if the monster was a golem type, its weak points and tactics to defeat it would still be the same. The supposed golem-type monster had no specific weak points even when taking damage. It possessed an ability that allowed it to regenerate, and since this was the case, it needed to take damage from multiple angles at the same time, and since he was a skill-based user at his core, he needed to materialize a grid and a lightning bolt of equal distance. This was because the creations made within the grid could move freely at the user's will. So our protagonist conjured multiple skills and attacked the monster, causing it to suffer great damage as the smoke dissipated. The monster appeared completely destroyed. The protagonist stated that he initially saw the special ability of the grid only as a support skill that helped his creations move faster. However, as the skill's proficiency increased, it could also be used as an offensive skill. At that moment, the system notified that the boss had been defeated. However, both the boss's name and the dungeons were censored, which obviously surprised him since he couldn't see any information about the monsters or the dungeon. But before him, something seemed to be forming. The system then notified that the passive ability, magic absorption, had been activated. Upon seeing this, the protagonist wondered what that was, then began to reflect on what had just happened. Memories of his previous game, and although he didn't know exactly what it was, there was one thing he was sure of. It was definitely him, and to be more specific, it was him from a few years in the future. In that future, the whole world had collapsed, horrible things had happened. Besides, he had absorbed all the experience and knowledge from that time, and even though it was the future, it probably wasn't the future of the world he was currently in. Besides, too many things didn't add up for this to be happening now, like the status window in front of him, something he had never been able to understand even in his past life. Seeing all this, the protagonist wondered if he had finally become a player. The term player was used for those who were chosen and awakened, and according to him, at that time, players didn't exist in this world. However, about 2 years ago, A small number of awakened individuals were chosen to become players. With this, a blue screen appeared visible only to those who were chosen. However, in the future, a mysterious thing called the system, something that seemed like a joke, was enough to shake everyone. After all, the system wasn't the only thing given to players. Each player received different things, like strength and unique abilities. These two things simply appeared out of nowhere. However, players, they used them and experienced explosive growth compared to other awakened individuals, and thanks to the leader, who was chosen as a player, the guild he belonged to was able to develop and become the first class guild. Even though he had no direct connection to it, he had to remain confident. Because he had perfected his skills and worked harder and harder, he declared that now he could check the skills he had learned through the system, although he had always thought it was something. However, after thinking for a moment, he realized that he had never had a skill triggered by a dead golem. Besides, he had never heard of it from any other player. He accumulated contaminated mana energy, so he declared that he now understood how to obtain that magic. However, he would think about it later, because for now his priority was to take care of his body. The scene shifted to the Hunters Association headquarters. A woman asked if he was sure he had let it go, because it was strange that a small guild had been destroyed after entering a dungeon. Unconfirmed. Besides, he was the only survivor of the 4 who had died. The man said he could have escaped. Moreover, he had taken care of the bodies. The association was informed. Also, the portal had disappeared, so they couldn't investigate further. However, the woman asked what he thought, since everything seemed strange to him. The man asked her if she really believed that a rank had killed the hunters and told her to wake up after all. This was not a police case. He claimed that even if something had happened, everything that occurred inside a dungeon could not be verified, so all they could do was gather evidence. The woman acknowledged that she knew that. Then, the man said they could have been one of those people after all. Several hunters had disappeared after entering unreported portals trying to make money and live in secret. Moreover, it was impossible for small guilds to win a bid for a portal. However, the man told her to call him if there were any further investigations and stated that he was leaving. As he exited, the man looked at the file, saying that his name was without Juno. He admitted that he hadn't told her the whole truth because this case felt different from the others. This situation gave him a strange feeling. For one, he had remained calm the whole time. Besides, he had no experience in dungeons and had witnessed a tragedy. Yet he wasn't panicking, and there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. Obviously, it could be his personality. However, he had seen people like that before. Although he knew something was wrong, he didn't know what it was. However, it wasn't something he should worry about at that moment, and he stated that he would analyze it later at another time. We see our protagonist walking through the streets while reflecting on what had happened. He declared that something felt off. This dungeon didn't exist in the memories of his past life. Besides, everyone had seen clearly the purchase license for the portal had the association's seal, but since it was registered as a non-confirmed portal by the association, someone must have impersonated them and deceived the Dawn Guild. Or maybe the association itself could be involved. However, what worried him the most was that this wasn't happening only to the Dawn Guild. After all, cases of missing persons had already become a problem. Although he didn't know the whole story, all the guilds mentioned in the news had a common theme. They all included players like Moon, Tuan, and even prodigies who would become heroes in the future. He then stated that there could be someone trying to erase the existence of those heroes. In other words, what he needed to do now was hide his abilities. Besides, he was the only survivor of a case of missing persons, and if he did anything suspicious, he would be caught in the act. He had 2 years until the first player selection to prepare. So he needed to mobilize each of his abilities and develop them by then. However, he needed to find a way to grow without drawing too much attention. Looking at the system window, he noticed there was a usable skill. Pointing with his finger, he claimed he had that 1 year later. Somewhere in the forest amidst the mountains, sounds of strikes and visible sparks could be heard. The hunter struck with his sword, but the monster raised a shield in time, blocking the attack, causing the man's blade to crack. Then it broke completely, leaving him very nervous. After that, the monster attacked, throwing him back. But he managed to land successfully and stuck the broken sword into the ground to stop himself. Then he looked at the monster, but without giving him time, the monster lunged at him, yet he managed to dodge it and landed near his companions, letting out a deep sigh as the enemy turned towards them and glared. With a fierce look, this was the Ghoul Lord with a danger level of a high-ranking ghoul. Possessing physical abilities superior to those of a common ghoul, the hunter got up and extended his trembling hand forward, questioning what he was doing there in a rank E dungeon. Besides, even rank E Hunters had said that this monster was difficult to handle. At that moment, the ghoul lunged forward to attack, but the man with the shield reacted in time, moving forward and blocking the attack with his shield. His hands trembled from the powerful impact, and he shouted that they couldn't hold out much longer. However, no matter what happened, they had to inflict at least some damage soon. The swordsman was horrified and explained that this was the blinding one for low-ranking hunters. But the gun, he didn't earn that title just because of his physical skills, since monsters at this level were vulnerable to magic. Any home team relied on it. But this monster defied that. Logic hunters, relying on low-level magic, felt fear for the first time. Despite that, the price of his foolishness and pride would generally be the annihilation of his group. They only had one physical damage dealer, but he was bad in combat, at close range, and his weapon was broken. Plus, there were no more weapons left, even though the tank had told him to attack in shock. He admitted he had gathered the maximum number of people due to his pride. However, hiring people and a mage ended up harming him this way. However, the man noticed something. He saw a young man breaking magical stones with a pickaxe. Assistants do not participate in battle. They only gather resources like magical stones and are seen as labor with no recognition or respect among the awakened. The hunter suddenly remembered they had an assistant and thought they were about to die. While he was just extracting crystals, suddenly what he saw surprised him. The pickaxe and the assistant's hands simply disappeared into thin air. He wondered if it was a creation skill, since it would be useful even without high quality. Considering they could still use it, he called out loudly to the assistant, and the assistant turned around. It was Juno. The man approached excited and asked if he was a creator and if he knew how to make swords. He confirmed that information. The man, showing his broken sword, asked him to make a sword, preferably a strong one. Juno apologized and reminded him he was an assistant, not a support. The swordsman trembled and said it wasn't the time for that, wondering if he didn't. He realized they were about to die, because if they couldn't handle the boss, he would also die with that. Juno let out a deep sigh. Reluctantly accepting the request, he began to create, while saying he had a condition after clearing the dungeon. They would have to forget about his skill, and upon dividing the loot, he would receive the same share as a support. He agreed to help if they accepted these terms. The man looked at the new weapon in his hands with surprise, despising the mediocre quality of someone who had failed as a creator and was now an assistant, finding it ridiculous to think they could clear a dungeon with just one weapon. Juno smiled and said it was funny how weapons in the hands of others started to change, and asserted that a good weapon was a necessary element to clear a dungeon at that moment. Our protagonist claimed he would guarantee something. As long as they had this element, they could clear that dungeon. Sometime later at the guild, or Uberkill, one of the 3 largest guilds in Korea, a girl named Minu walked down the hallway and stopped in front of the huge doors, then knocked, and Juno, sitting at the desk inside the room, allowed her to enter. She greeted him as the guildmaster and informed him that the association had sent a cooperation request. He asked her about the errors in the dungeon levels, and she confirmed it, explaining that it looked like a request for standard cooperation, but with payment as indicated. Tahan asked if they had an option because it was hard to find another individual awakened capable of forcibly entering a closed portal. However, he noticed a familiar face. The system showed news about a Type A dungeon that had been successfully cleared, and he recognized a familiar face in the team photo. An A-rank dungeon had appeared in the Shoto a few weeks ago. They had sent him to the area, and he had definitely seen him there. The data showed that he was an assistant, and although new dungeons appeared frequently, the chance of a bug occurring in it still remained low, and the number of cases with survivors in Vax dungeons could be counted on one hand. However, this assistant had been part of a team that had had survivors, not just once but twice. He exclaimed that this couldn't be a coincidence. Jesus commented that it seemed lately that more Vax dungeons were appearing. A Type A dungeon had recently been downgraded to Type B a few days ago, and the entire team had been instantly annihilated. The leader said that the Hunters Association must be facing many problems, and added that many people were criticizing the association. After all, it was their responsibility to analyze, predict, and announce the dungeon levels. Tahan closed his eyes and rubbed his chin, confused, thinking that the guy from the association must be struggling a lot right now. He commented on the growing number of people with invasion skills and the need to pay additional fees for a while to monitor the situation. However, Tahan then asked about what he had requested her to investigate. She replied that she had searched everywhere but found not a single rank A or higher blacksmith. However, she had received a rank B weapon from a Japanese blacksmith and asked if he wanted to try it, to which he replied that any weapon below rank A would be destroyed. He stood up from his chair and began to say that many blacksmiths were support. He told her to keep looking, Otherwise, he would continue destroying all the weapons at that moment. Someone knocked on the door. Someone entered the office saying that something had happened. Tahan got up from his desk and walked toward him, asking what had happened. The person reported that it was an urgent message from the association regarding the location of a Type D dungeon where the newbies had entered as a free attack team. Tahan asked what the current level was, and he replied that it was now Type C. After hearing this, Tahan sighed and said that they couldn't afford to lose the newbies. It also seemed like an emergency, so he would go personally. Soon they arrived at the location of the gates where the journalists had gathered. Upon noticing the presence of the guildmaster or Uberkill, they asked Tahan to comment about the errors in the dungeons and questioned him if he had come. Because members of his guild were part of the attack team, he ignored them, and the worried girl who had been waiting thanked him for coming personally and asked him about the situation. She explained that the attack team was made up of 6 hunters, 2 supports, and 1 assistant. However, the numbers didn't matter since the dungeon was now of rank. He wondered how long they had been inside. She replied that it had been about 2 hours after approaching the portal. She said she didn't know how many of them were still alive, but she would do everything possible. The woman gave a slight bow and thanked him, then looked at the door and threw her briefcase to the ground. She extended her hand towards the secretary to hand her something. She reached into her bag, from which a bright light emerged, and pulled out a sword. Since she was a rank B support specialized in opening subspaces, even in closed areas. After that, she handed the weapon to the guildmaster. At that moment, he struck the door hard. His invasion skill activated along with a small crack that appeared on the door, growing larger in seconds. His ability to force a path was capable of breaking any barrier, including doors. However, when moving to another dimension, the skill only affected the user after this strike. His sword broke, and he returned it to Jesus, who asked him to be careful. He accepted and then decided to pass through the crack in the door. Inside the dungeon, he stopped immediately and looked around, noticing a change in temperature and humidity. Increased in the air by the unpleasant smell, there must have been reptiles living there. The fact that the ground was clean indicated that it was a relatively intelligent monster. Considering the level of the dungeon, the answer was quite obvious. Lizardmen were monsters. Humanoid reptilians of rank that lived in tribal groups, possessing a lifespan proportional to their intelligence and combat strength. So he continued towards another room, thinking he could deduce the size of the group, the combat strength, and assess the level of danger as identified in the report. However, they might already be dead by the time he arrived. As he advanced, he suddenly heard sounds of battle and voices, and couldn't help but imagine the worst. But when he reached the place where the team was, he saw something unexpected. The monsters were attacking, but the hunters were blocking their strikes and counterattacking immediately, acting in perfect coordination as a team. A girl shot an arrow that pierced one of the monsters. Tahan was surprised, wondering if they were really winning against the lizardmen hunters' movements. They were suddenly visibly stronger, and his thoughts were interrupted when he saw, in the next moment, one of the monsters taking a weapon from a hunter. The man looked up in terror, realizing he was about to receive a powerful blow. Tahan ran to help him, thinking it wasn't too late yet. But then suddenly, the lizardman launched its attack. However, its strike was blocked by a sword that appeared out of nowhere, leaving him deeply shocked. The hunter's breath quickened with fear. Meanwhile, the guildmaster, running to assist him, stopped and thought it could be magic. However, he quickly dismissed that idea upon realizing it was a weapon crafted in a deer. Still, he wanted to know who had made it. He turned and saw the assistant near the crystals, the one who had conjured that sword. Noticing Tahan's gaze, Juno slightly turned his head, and their eyes met. He looked at the team members fighting the monsters and started counting them. When he counted a total of 9 people, he diverted his gaze back to Tahan and pointed at him with a finger, saying he was the 10th. Tahan explained that this was strange, since he clearly remembered that only 9 had entered. The guildmaster frowned and asked what he was doing. At that moment, one of the team members blocked an attack, but the monster was stronger and sent him flying backward. The mage immediately ran to help him. Meanwhile, the lizardmen raised their swords above their heads, preparing to strike. Seeing this, Tahan grew worried and quickly moved to attack, unsheathing his sword. Meanwhile, Juno looked at his open briefcase and thought he hadn't expected young Tahan to come personally to help them. He noticed that Tahan had brought an extra weapon. The warm wind caused by Tahan's strike brushed his face. He covered his sword with flames and pressed harder against the opponent's sword, breaking through its defense. Then he ordered the hunters behind him to fall back. The mage helped his teammate to get up and thanked him for the assistance. After that, Tahan disarmed his opponent, reignited the flames, and charged forward, delivering powerful blows, and soon the monster's body was covered in numerous cuts from which green blood flowed until its corpse fell to the ground with a loud crash. Tahan explained that despite being a rank B weapon, it had not yet reached its full potential. He looked up and saw the lizardman charging at him. The monster attacked, and Tahan defended himself before jumping back. He stopped next to Juno, who called his name. He asked if this happened every time he used a skill, as it seemed very exhausting. The others rushed toward the monster, and the guild leader asked if he was asking for trouble. Suddenly, sparks appeared. Blue appeared before his face, and from it, a weapon materialized. Juno handed it to him, asking him to take it and not destroy his poor weapon, Tahan. He looked at the sword in surprise because Juno had materialized it with a single gesture. Tahan commented that he was a weapon creator. Extremely skilled, he noticed the pickaxe in his hand and questioned if he was an assistant, remembering that low-rank support sometimes entered the dungeons in that role. But suddenly, the protagonist interrupted his thoughts. He took the broken sword from Tahan's hands and said there was a condition. After cleaning and leaving the dungeon, he would have to forget about him and his abilities. Tahan reached out for the new sword and asked if he really thought he could just forget about him because he wanted to do so in response to his words. Juno began to destroy the sword and said that if not, he should let it go and finish everyone off with his high-class weapon. The guildmaster sighed and thought the weapon would break as soon as he used a skill with it, so having a few more wouldn't hurt. He took the sword and replied that he understood everything and also promised to forget about it. At that moment, Juno smiled and said he could leave after that. The guildmaster rushed to attack and approached the furious lizard man. Then he ignited the sword with a bright flame and struck, causing a massive explosion of flames around him. The monster used more strength to try to withstand his attack, but in the end, his sword broke. However, Tahan thought he just wanted to counter the attack, but his opponent's weapon ended up breaking first. He looked at his sword and thought his control was visibly better than usual, and wondered if the weapon itself was strong. Then he looked at Juno, who was collecting crystals at that moment, and expressed his surprise that he was able to manifest a weapon above rank B. At that moment, the monster decided to attack him with a broken weapon, raising its sword over its head to strike Tahan. He prepared himself, thinking this was interesting, wanting to see what the weapon was capable of. He declared that it would amplify the power. With those thoughts, he plunged the tip into the monster's abdomen, causing the flames from the sword to pierce through the monster's body and emerge in a bright flash. Without wasting time, the guildmaster propelled himself from the monster's shoulder and jumped behind it. Then he soared upward and raised his sword again. Igniting it once more, he plunged the blade into the monster's head, piercing it and making it scream loudly. Then the blood spurted from its mouth, and its body collapsed to the ground. At that moment, Tahan noticed that there wasn't a single scratch on his sword, which at least he needed, but was interrupted by someone calling him. It was people thanking him for his presence. Since they only survived thanks to him, he approached them and said it seemed like no one was seriously hurt, which made him happy. One of the men focused his attention on Juno and said that with his weapon they wouldn't have even been able to fight, but they held out thanks to him. The guild leader himself directed his gaze at him, thinking about something. Then he approached and asked for his name. The protagonist questioned the reason for the question. He replied that they should know each other to be able to call each other correctly, and introduced himself as John Tahan while closing his backpack. Juno turned to him, then stood up and approached, saying his name. Looking at the man behind him, he said he would lead the stone man at the entrance. The man accepted with a confused expression. Just as Juno was about to leave, Tahan stopped him and asked him to wait. Offering to accompany him to the boss's room, he took the backpack from his hands, and Juno declared that he was just an assistant. The guild leader handed the backpack to another man, explaining that a glitch in the dungeon prevented them from leaving without defeating the boss, so he explained that he could take care of it. At that moment, Tahan said that no weapon would be able to withstand completely his ability. However, breaking the weapons he himself had created would be unnecessary. The protagonist replied with a hint of irritation that his weapon wouldn't break, to which Tahan responded that he thought the same, and explained that they were in a dungeon with glitches. The creatures living there were not just simple men, a lizard, and if the boss was the same, then it wouldn't hurt to have a bit of extra caution. Juno sighed heavily. Deciding to accept, he threw the backpacks to the ground, and as soon as he approached him, he asked if all he had to do was move forward. Soon they found themselves in a large hall lit by torches. Frozen at the entrance, they saw a throne at the end of the hall, where the lizard Lord of Danger Level sat. Tahan explained that they should ignore the existing danger levels and any information about them, and with a smile said they would finish this as quickly as possible. Both activated their abilities, and Tahan lamented that the weapon could break, to which the protagonist replied that he had already ensured that wouldn't happen. Then the Lizard King extended his hand towards them, pointing the tip of his spear at them, ordering his lizard men to charge and attack. As soon as the lizard men attacked, both jumped back. Then, Tahan propelled himself from the wall and advanced quickly. The Lizard Lord noticed this, and when he landed too close, the beast swung its claw. At that moment he held his sword in front of him. Just then, the monster lunged its tail forward, sending a powerful gust of wind in his direction, forcing him to increase the distance between them. Then he propelled himself again and ran, but this time, the lizard man charged directly at him, their swords clashing with a loud crash, and both retreated again. However, the man mounted his lizard man, who began to spit tongues of fire from his mouth. Then a powerful jet of fire shot toward the man. He wanted to block the attack with his sword, but Juno created a shield in front of him just in time, protecting him from the intense explosion. He stayed aside watching the fight at that moment. The lizard man charged, throwing Tahan backward, landing next to Juno. He asked if he was just a weapon creator. The protagonist replied that a shield could also become a weapon. He ignited his sword with flames and smiled, saying that once they got out of there, he would have many questions for him. After those words, he ran toward his opponent, and the lizard man swung his hand, launching a chain from his spear that had a sharp tip. The chain hit the sword and wrapped around the blade. Then the lizard man withdrew his hand, dragging the enemy toward him. Tahan was pulled directly into the lizard man's open mouth. Seeing this, Juno extended his hand forward and told him to stop messing around in the fight. He deconstructed the weapon, and Tahan let it go, smiled, and asked if he hadn't asked to try it. A new weapon appeared in his hand, and the exhausted protagonist told him to take care of his pet. After that, the chain weapon that had not yet faded flew over the lizard man's head, and Tahan delivered several cuts to his mouth. Seeing blood come out, the monster flinched. Then the man threw a sword at him, but the monster managed to dodge it just in time in the blink of an eye. Tahan got very close and then kicked him with all his might, sending him flying to the side. The lizard man fell off the back of his lizard man, and at that moment, Tahan lifted him into the air, swinging his sword and igniting it again. What he saw made the monster nervous. He had no time to react before receiving a powerful blow that cut off his arm. Realizing that he couldn't defend himself, he looked toward Juno, who had not participated in the battle. Grabbing his spear, he charged directly at him, but the protagonist was prepared for this. And just before the attack arrived, he raised a shield in front of him, which made the monster anxious. The protagonist then asked with disgust who had thought it was a good idea to aim a weapon at him at that moment. Tahan appeared behind the monster, engulfed in raging flames. The lizard man didn't know what to do. He was trapped on both sides. Meanwhile, the people outside continued watching the door, seeing how it changed to blue, which made them happy as it meant the door was opening. After that, the guild team emerged from the portal, and the reporters immediately rushed toward Tahan. Anxious to know what was inside the dungeon and what had happened with the boss, the guards surrounded him, and Jesus asked if he was injured, to which he replied that he was fine. His guildmates thanked him from behind for his help. The girl said that if it weren't for him, they would already be dead. Meanwhile, Kuno handed the collected resources to the man and stated that since he had already received his payment in advance, he needed to leave. The protagonist, taking one last look at the team, simply walked away. One of the journalists approached the guild leader and asked how he managed to clear the dungeon so quickly. He turned around and said he wasn't alone there, but when he didn't see Juno behind him, he froze. The man asked if he did that. While everyone was somehow blocking together with teamwork, which allowed them to handle everything, the warrior next to him said that their weapons had broken, and if it weren't for the guild leader, they would have been destroyed a long time ago. Hearing this, Tahan explained that thanks to those people who kept making weapons for them, they had lasted so long. The man replied that he was talking about the support that was there as an assistant, who was also a weapon maker. Still confused, the warrior asserted that he knew someone had helped a support and then asked the girl if he had that skill. She said she wasn't sure. After hearing her responses, Tahan turned to the rest of the team and asked if they hadn't seen him create weapons. They looked at the backpack they had left behind, where the pickaxe should have been. Someone commented that he didn't even have it. Another team member replied that yes, he had it, but he must have lost it. However, he had collected all the mana stones. Tahan was confused and wondered what had happened. After all, he had created weapons for all of them, but it seemed like they had forgotten. He remembered how Juno had asked him to forget everything about making weapons. He was surprised, wondering if that was a rent payment. However, he questioned how someone could use a skill exclusive to rank a creators. His friends called him, not understanding what was wrong. After that, he threw the weapon case into the hands of his vice leader and ran off in search of Juno. He and his secretary watched him, confused. He continued running and looking around, wondering where Juno had gone, questioning if he had really disappeared. Suddenly, he stopped. Juno was nearby, hiding behind a brick wall. Seeing that there was no one else around, Tahan realized he wouldn't be able to reach him at that moment. Hidden behind a brick wall, seeing that no one else was around, Tahan realized he couldn't reach him at that moment. His guild members ran towards him, asking what had happened. He turned to Wee and told him he needed to find someone now. Then a scene showed our protagonist leaving. Time passed, and soon he reached the guild leader with the news that he had determined the location of Sinjonio, who had entered a nearby ranked dungeon, being at 1 p.m. with a group of 5 people. Tahan told him he had done a great job. However, Jesus asked why he was interested in the protagonist. Tahan looked at the tablet and asked if he really thought that way. He considered that of course Juno was a rank creator of, otherwise, it would be hard to imagine. He reviewed his general information and thought that according to all the records, he was ranked as such, but he had a rental fee, and that ability contradicted all the rental fee. It was a lower rank ability, the rental fee ability. It was incredibly powerful, and he claimed he had never seen anyone use it that way. Moreover, Kuno was using it just to hide his true ability. A weapon creator like him could level up easily, but he would find out when he met him. At that moment, he felt something he had never felt before. He remembered the sensation of holding the sword that Juno had created and thought he could fight with all his strength, without worrying about the weapon breaking, despite having met many blacksmiths considered the best. As soon as they presented their latest products, he took them with hope and tried to use his ability on them. Although those blacksmiths were confident in their products, as soon as he made a powerful fire strike, he felt immediately disappointed. Since all the weapons broke in the end, the blacksmiths who had been so confident in their products ended up holding their heads, frustrated to see their items destroyed. None of the weapons met Tahan's expectations, not to mention that the creation ability was limited to normal weapon types, but Juno had created something that greatly exceeded that type and ability limitation. It was as if there were no restrictions with Juno's ability. This was possible, something he hadn't used because he didn't have the right weapon. The time required to clear a ranked dungeon with 5 people was 4 hours, leaving only 1 hour remaining. He got up and asked Jesus, who was still on schedule. She explained that she had a meeting with the guildmaster, Kenmo. However, he told her to cancel the meeting because he would leave early. He wanted to make sure not to miss the opportunity. Meanwhile, inside the dungeon, the team was fighting against orcs. A warrior pierced one in the stomach, causing its death, and watched as their bodies fell. Soon he was amazed by the power of that creation and wondered if it was really something made by an assistant. If that amount of mana could destroy a boss weapon, it must be at least a rank C ability or maybe even higher. When the weapon broke, he thought everything was lost, but he never imagined his assistant had such ability. He picked up the sword and laughed out loud, saying it was simply impressive. I had never seen a sword of such high quality. He looked at Juno and thanked her for her help, then asked the girl if she wasn't in any guild. Maybe they should recruit him into theirs. She replied that it would be a great idea and said she thought so too. It was somewhat embarrassing that he was just an assistant. He asked if that was true, to which he laughed and replied that she had a good eye. Listening to their conversation, the protagonist realized he could use more mana, more than he had imagined, and thought about how hard the team had fought, even though it wasn't a failed dungeon. He walked to the spot where the mana stones grew and dropped his backpack on the ground, thinking that if he had had more mana back then, everything would have been different in that dungeon. He felt an incredible amount of mana like never before after defeating the golem and using all his mana. It never appeared again. What he felt now was nothing more than the mana of an awakened rank. But he felt relieved, knowing that there was no problem in creating weapons. He created a pickaxe and looked at it, thinking about who would have thought that memories could be so useful. The basic skill of a creator is the creation of special objects whose quality depends on the amount of mana used. Despite being a very intuitive skill, there is a way to increase the efficiency of the skill, but it remains unknown. This is the level of understanding. The higher the level of understanding of the created object, the better its quality. The skill's strong point is that by increasing quality, it improves the mana efficiency, creating the same object but with variable quality. He remembered how much he had trained when he learned about this hidden skill, studying the material, training in support, and going to the workshop for weapon creation lessons. But he achieved more than he expected, so he started mining mana stones with his pickaxe and thought he didn't know which would be better, but compared to using mana, it seemed more than just a slight increase. However, it still wasn't enough. It was hard to use creation and payment at the same time. The gear that affected mana was expensive, so there was no way to buy it now. At least he could buy a mana potion, the only mass-produced item that affected mana. He needed to request some of those potions, but with an assistant's salary, it would still be difficult. However, no one would hire a support of rank D, so he had no choice. He opened the window, showing the passive skill of mana absorption, and thought the result wasn't bad. It was reassuring. He was very close to reaching the 20% mana absorption goal. Clearing several dungeons wouldn't be enough. A protected dungeon only yielded a little over 1x101 efficiency, very low. There was only one option: go to the insect dungeon. That was the only way to absorb a large amount of mana at once compared to other dungeons. It absorbed several times more mana. He explained that before entering, he couldn't predict the difficulty of the rank error in a dungeon. Moreover, it would be difficult for the Cetajan since he wasn't there. He considered finding a dungeon with a lower rank boss to prepare. Since advancing as an awakened rank depended on understanding the value of mana absorption, soon the team managed to clear the dungeon successfully and exited. Everyone thanked each other for their cooperation and said goodbye to the protagonist. Realizing that they hadn't said a word about his ability, he was pleased that he had erased their memories. Suddenly, a familiar voice calling his name froze him. He turned around immediately and saw the guild leader, or Overkill, approaching, along with the secretary Tahan, who asked if he remembered him. Hearing that, the protagonist realized that the ability hadn't worked on him, so he sighed deeply and asked if Tahan would believe him if he said he didn't remember. Tahan handed him a business card and replied that he wouldn't believe it. He took the card and asked why he had come, to which Tahan replied that he needed to talk to him about something and that he needed a minute of his time. Upon seeing the information on the card, the protagonist thought that Overkill was one of the best guilds in Korea. He couldn't join such a big guild yet, but he still needed to find an excuse to leave. After putting the card in his pocket, he turned around and said he didn't have time, that he was in a hurry for an important meeting, but Tahan had no intention of letting him go that easily. He put a hand on his shoulder, saying he wouldn't regret this conversation, that it wouldn't take much time and that he would even pay for dinner. Juno commented that being a guild leader must free up a lot of time. If he was using it to talk with a rank supporter, the protagonist looked closely at him and thought he didn't like that very much. But he needed to check how the rent payment worked with him while walking beside him. He agreed to talk, but only if it was quick. Tahan smiled and agreed. After that, they arrived at a restaurant and took a table in a private quarter. When the table was set with various dishes, the protagonist asked why a guild leader would talk to a rank supporter. He doubted it was just because Tahan had free time to chat with him. Tahan said that from what he had seen, Juno was a berserker due to his incredible strength. He needed a weapon that could withstand such power, so the most important part of the job for a berserker was to find a supplier of suitable weapons. Obviously, he had gone to many places looking, traveling across the country and beyond, starting with a blacksmith considered the best in his field and ending with the few remaining weapon creators. If there was even the slightest chance, he would commission a weapon. Time and money didn't matter. However, all the weapons he had used until now had failed to withstand completely his abilities. But there was one exception. The sword that our protagonist had created. The antagonist understood one thing. The agreement had no effect on him. He hadn't thought the berserker. The antagonist understood one thing. The agreement had no effect on him. He hadn't thought that the berserker had an annulment ability. He had been too careless and needed to be more careful when using that ability with high-ranking hunters. Tahan called his name and, with a serious expression, said he was going to ask directly. He then asked if the protagonist would like to join his guild, surprising Geso. He stated that he already knew Juno wasn't a member of any guild. If he joined, Tahan promised he would get the best deal. They would pay 10 billion wons for his entry, cover operational costs separately, and provide dividends, with a 1-year contract and a 10% increase for each renewal. Juno didn't let him finish. He got up from the table and apologized, saying he had no plans to join a guild for now, so he would have to decline the offer. If that was all, he would leave. Thanked Tahan for the meal with a slight smile and exited the room. Tahan called him, trying to stop him. Jesus asked why he had made such an offer, since he couldn't have done it without a reason. He was about to say something about the conditions, but he interrupted her, saying that if she had experienced the same as him, she wouldn't be saying that. It had been a long time since he felt the scream of a sword, and with a weapon like that, he felt he could do anything, and it resisted. She wanted to tell him something, but while he took a sip, he said of course, it wasn't just about that feeling. Then he asked how many high-level weapons had broken in a single year. His words reminded her of the astronomical amounts he spent on weapons, even if they broke, because they couldn't withstand the strain. If the weapon wasn't of a certain rank, he wouldn't allow the guild leader to use their abilities. After thinking it over, she agreed with him and said that if such a price for a contract were possible, it would really be insignificant. But for now, the problem was that no one was capable of doing something like that, not even among those considered the best. However, he didn't let her finish and said that Juno could definitely do it. She was surprised by those words, and he continued saying that therefore, no matter what Juno asked for, he wanted to recruit him at all costs. Time passed, and the protagonist walked down the street, but he still couldn't believe he had rejected such an offer from the Overkill Guild and Jung Tahan. This would have helped him a lot, but it was still too soon. However, he just needed to be patient. He would definitely run into them again. Meanwhile, in an unknown dungeon, several goblin corpses were scattered on the ground, and a hunter watched as his companion had an arm ripped off. Catching his breath, he nervously looked at the one who did it and asked who he was. The man stabbed his sword into the hunter's body and said it was quite entertaining at times like this. People begged and pleaded to be saved, but the one who would become the hero was different. He smiled at the only survivor. The boy asked why he suddenly wanted to kill them and take the trophy. However, the man replied that it wasn't that boring, and that he didn't want to say that. He pulled the sword from the corpse and said that saying something to someone about to die would be pointless, but he would reveal it if they defeated him. Throwing the sword over his shoulder, with a smile, and told him to come quickly if he didn't want to die, the hunter gritted his teeth and thought that definitely. It was a tough opponent because he would die if he stayed at a distance. He decided to close the gap and charged forward with a loud shout, thinking he had to go for it even if he lost an arm or a leg. In response, the man raised his sword in front of him, blocking the blow. The hunter shouted, putting all his strength into the attack, then began delivering new strikes, but all were repelled as he watched the sparks flying from their swords upon collision. The man suddenly disarmed him. Sending the sword flying over his head, the hunter looked at the sword in shock, and then his opponent kicked him with all his might, sending him crashing through the hallway. The hunter slammed against the wall and trembled in pain, saying it was sad. Dragging his sword along the ground, the man said he had volunteered for this because it was the first ranked domination of a hero. However, he didn't know it would turn out to be such a small fish. Yet the courage he had shown in doing this was praiseworthy. When his shadow loomed over him, the hunter begged for forgiveness with tears in his eyes and began to plead for mercy. However, the man didn't care and raised his sword above him, smiling as he said he would take care of him, then delivered a fatal strike from which a torrent of blood gushed forth. He looked at him with disappointment and cursed, saying he thought for the first time in a long time he was going to have a real fight. But this wasn't even a warm-up for him. He questioned the look of injustice on the hunter's face, yet told him not to worry anymore, because he would make sure to say that he fought valiantly against the boss and died like a hero. Pulling out his phone, he took a photo of the corpse and said with a smile that this was something common in a dungeon with a rank error. After finishing, he looked at the photos and said they weren't bad. The collection had grown. Scrolling through the images of the other corpses, he added that his whole life was dedicated to collecting them. Suddenly, for some reason, he felt a chill run down his spine. He told the priestess with disgust that he hated feeling that vile energy, and ordered her to either hide it or stop concealing it. The hallway doors opened, and the priestess entered, greeting him with a smile and apologizing, saying she was in a hurry because she had heard there were valuable components there, pulling the sword from the corpse, and responding that there were only fools there. She passed by him before he could finish speaking, and threateningly asked if those words meant she wanted to go against the executor. He sighed irritably, calling her sensitive and telling her to clean up the place. She used her skills, accepting and declaring that she was an expert at it. With a grim expression, she reminded him his promise to send him after an S-rank hunter because of that awareness or whatever needed to kill them, but he couldn't use all his power. So if he followed him just for that, the priestess approached the corpse of the hunter, and creating a magic circle over him, assured him that he didn't need to worry since she would contact him soon. A glow appeared in the wound of the corpse, and he asked who it would be this time. A claw emerged from the body of the dead hunter, as the monster rose, and the priestess smiled in admiration, called him a child, and happily exclaimed that she was right. A tall, humanoid monster, whose body burned with energy, appeared before her. Time passed and a new day began. The guards of the association and the curious gathered around the open doors. Juno, who had just arrived, noticed someone familiar and looked at him with displeasure. Tahan, who was also there, adjusted his cap and asked if he was really there. Silence hung between them after a brief pause. The protagonist asked what he was doing there. Tahan replied that he had a good eye to recognize him so quickly, and observing the case on his back, commented that he only knew one person who carried a weapon like that. So what was he doing there? Tahan replied that the guild member who was supposed to come had suddenly fallen ill, so they sent him instead. The protagonist didn't believe him and was about to question him when one of the members of the team shouted that it was time to go. Tahan passed by him and suggested they enter the dungeon. The protagonist said he knew he would run into him again, but didn't expect it to be so soon, decided to accept the situation and adjust his plans, so they passed through the gates and found themselves in a spacious cave. Tahan asked why Juno didn't join a guild. He replied that he had already turned it down and didn't want to talk about it anymore. One of the men asked if they had heard about the door auction that took place in Chunin that morning. The man said he heard that the Hyuga Guild had won, added that a friend was there, and said they made such a high bid that no one dared to compete. Juno became interested, wondering if they had really found something there. Tahan asked if he was interested in buying a door, since if he joined the guild he could easily acquire special doors above rank B. This was not only due to resources, but also because the guild's name granted certain privileges. Joining a guild meant a lot for an awakened individual. People admired and respected the great guilds. A hunter not only gained employment but also obtained. People admired and respected the major guilds. A hunter not only gained employment but also earned better income and rewards compared to others. Additionally, by becoming part of a guild, a hunter enjoyed various benefits derived from its influence. For example, they could access special doors that required not only skills but also strong political connections. With this structure, the rare treasures obtained in such places were naturally monopolized by the major guilds. Tan stated that Juno probably had a goal as an awakened one, whatever it was. It would be easier to achieve with overkill. He didn't understand why Juno kept refusing. The protagonist responded firmly that it was none of his business. He understood why Tahan acted this way. Probably no one had ever turned down an offer to join overkill before. So, to be clear, he wouldn't join any guild under any circumstances. These words surprised Tahan, who stood still for a moment, thinking it might be due to the injury he received after the Dawn Guild's destruction. As he had read in the report, or maybe it was something else, whatever it was, he couldn't give up. Time passed as they moved through the cave. The wizard at the front began to light the way. They looked around when suddenly a man stumbled upon something and exclaimed, "What is this?" He touched his hair, feeling a texture similar to a thread between his fingers, and asked, "Is this a spider web?" The girl lifted her staff, casting more light in the area. The group leader moved forward and said that this was where the monster's territory began. It seemed that all the hunters here were novices, so he briefly explained. Although everyone had already read the report, the spider legionaries began to appear. Each creature had a low difficulty level, their peculiarity being that they lived in groups. According to the reconnaissance analysis, there were about 50 of them, which wasn't too many. The hunters were warned about the paralyzing poison present in the creature's fangs and were alerted not to let them bite. Tahan crouched down, drew his sword from its sheath, and turned to Juno, saying that the creatures were about to appear, suggesting she stay close. The protagonist replied with a sarcastic smile that he didn't need to worry about a sidekick, just get ready for the fight. However, Tahan insisted that all combat units had the responsibility of protecting support and assistance, regardless of skill or situation. That was a rule all hunters had to follow. Juno, with a dissatisfied expression, replied that no one followed his principles like that anymore, but her words were interrupted by a scream from a team member. Announcing the arrival of the creatures, the noises grew louder, and everyone immediately prepared, looking up at the ceiling. The sharp sounds of the spider's claws echoed as they approached, moving along the walls and ceiling. Seeing the monsters, the swordsman trembled with fear, trying to calm himself and reminding himself that they would win if they followed what they had learned. Thus, the spider legionaries appeared one by one, classified as rank threats. But in groups, they reached rank D, increasing danger as their numbers grew. A horde of creatures advanced rapidly. The hunters prepared for battle. The swordsman took a stable stance, and with a precise strike, took down a spider. Gritting his teeth and attacking again, meanwhile, another hunter blocked the monsters with his shield. Focusing energy, he repelled them with a powerful blow. The mage used her magic, creating sparks from her staff that pierced the enemies. Observing the battle, Tahan concluded that despite being novices, they were performing well. This gave Juno, who was watching from the side of the hallway, less concern. He sighed, surprised. This caught Tahan's attention. He turned around, and Juno remarked that there seemed to be many more than just a few. dozens of spiders. At that moment, several of them jumped from the ceiling, attacking the group. Tahan activated his ability, swinging his sword and burning multiple creatures. Their charred bodies fell to the ground. He continued his attack, reflecting that the durability of these spiders was lower compared to other monsters, only releasing. A little energy from his sword could eliminate them without even using the blade, allowing him to finish the raid without damaging his weapon. Meanwhile, cries for help came from another direction. 3 team members were surrounded by a large group of spiders, making the fight increasingly difficult. The team leader exclaimed that the number of enemies was much higher than expected. There were not just 50 spiders, but hundreds. The situation worsened, and the mage announced she was running out of mana. Determined to help, Tahan ran towards them, calling Juno to follow him. However, the protagonist went in the opposite direction, saying it was better for him to help the others while he finished there and then join the group. Tahan stopped, confused, seeing him walk towards the monsters. When a spider lunged to attack him, he ran forward, worried, shouting for him to duck, thinking that not using energy in his sword could result in him getting hurt. But at that moment, Juno stopped, closed his eyes, and when he opened them, his irises changed color. He observed a web forming on the ceiling. The spider that had entered the web was immediately pierced by a sharp blade, and Tahan was stunned by the scene. The spider's body fell at Juno's feet, who calmly analyzed the situation. Among all the weapons he could create at that moment, the sword would be of the highest quality. It would be more efficient to create several swords and use them simultaneously. But with his current mana reserves, that was impossible. With a slight movement of his finger, he pulled the sword from the spider's body and aimed it forward, thinking there was nothing better he could do at that moment. At his command, the sword rose into the air and began to spin around him, awaiting his next command, observing the nearby monsters. He turned around and pointed at them with his finger, sending the sword toward the monsters as he approached. The sword pierced through a spider in its path and then moved on to the next, cutting quickly. With just a movement of his hand, Juno controlled the sword, making it sweep through the cavern at a furious speed. In a moment, he raised his finger toward the ceiling, pointing at the remaining spiders. After that, the sword shot forward and spun around like a whirlwind, cutting through everything in its path when it finished thud. He looked at him in shock, then glanced at the many corpses already at his feet, then diverted his gaze to the sword. Embedded in the body of the spider, he wondered in confusion if that was some kind of attack while watching the sword dissolve. He reflected that in less than 10 seconds of combat, Juno had taken care of those dozens of spiders. He didn't even know they could fight like that. Noticing his gaze, Juno pointed to the rest of the group and asked what he was doing. If he wasn't going to help him due to his words, Lahan suddenly remembered the other teammates he had initially run to help. He turned around and saw they were barely managing to stay on their feet. Realizing the situation wasn't good, he activated his ability and said they would talk after it was all over. Before leaving, Juno called him and pointed to the bodies behind him, asking him to take care of them. After all, they wouldn't think an assistant had done all of that. Tahan lowered his mask, thinking about it for a second. Then he pushed hard off the ground and moved forward, burning the bodies. Soon the battle ended, and the team members gathered to rest. One of the hunters thanked Tahan for his help, saying they had survived thanks to him, but he was a bit surprised. At first, he thought he looked familiar, but who would have guessed he was the guildmaster, Uberkill Tahan? He apologized for not mentioning it earlier and explained he wanted to explore the dungeon discreetly. The mage was excited to discover his true identity and thanked him, then with admiration said it was amazing to see how he handled all those spiders. A bit embarrassed, she hesitated for a moment before asking if it would be possible to take a picture with him once they got out. The hunter who had returned with Juno interrupted her before she could finish, announcing loudly that they were already back. She made a disappointed expression, thinking she had missed a golden opportunity. The young man smiled, apologizing for the delay. They started collecting secondary resources and walked through the area. It seemed there were no more monsters left. He pointed to a dark corridor and said there was another way through there. He thought they could move forward. The leader sighed heavily and said he didn't think they were in condition to continue. Clearing the dungeon was a shame, but they had to end it there. The swordsman exclaimed in surprise that they were already so close, why he had decided that the man stood up and crossed his arms over his chest, saying that the number of spiders they had found, the geography of the dungeon, and everything else was different from the intelligence report. Dungeons exist as separate portals from the world. They are areas with strange creatures and characteristics, geographical features that are not found on land. Currently, the concept of dungeons and awakened beings is not completely defined. So for novice hunters, Information about dungeons is the most important few awakened individuals. They can adapt to a dungeon if they have never encountered one before. This means defeat, and in the worst case, death. This is how explorers emerged. Awakened individuals with detection or stealth abilities who group together and start to gather information about dungeons. The rank of a strong dungeon increases after such reconnaissances, and thus they began to be called explorers. The leader also added that the accuracy of these reconnaissance missions generally exceeds 90% and 8%. It is unlikely this is just an error, cannot be dismissed. That this could also be a misclassified dungeon. The swordsman was confused and wanted to argue, but then he turned his gaze to Tahan and asked if with the guildmaster with them they could still continue. The man said he understood they wanted to keep clearing the dungeon, but the help of the guildmaster alone would not be enough. If they were not careful, everyone could end up in danger, frustrated. The young man said he really wanted to clear the dungeon because he had personal reasons. The girl also expressed her frustration, saying she wanted to finish the dungeon. He asked what could be more important than their lives if they entered the boss room. There would be no turning back. He didn't want to leave either, but first they needed to report the situation. The guild leader joined the conversation and said he agreed with them. The team leader looked at him with a confused expression, and Tahan asserted that even though he was there to study, he was still a member of the group. If the leader decided to keep clearing the dungeon, he had no reason to object, however. If he wanted to study everything, he would have to enter the boss room. He glanced at Juno, who nodded in agreement, and the man bowed, saying he would trust him with this. Thanking him, he began to talk about being the team leader, but Tahan reassured him, asking him to keep leading. The man agreed, and announced they would move forward. He instructed the others to follow him, and as they passed through a large hallway, they found themselves in front of a set of doors. The leader stopped and reported that he believed they had arrived at the boss room, so he would give some final instructions first. He said that the boss of this dungeon was a spider queen of superior rank, with considerably high combat skills, was considered a relatively easy boss, mainly focused on spawning legion spiders. However, those were just the initial reports, and no one knew what kind of creature would truly be behind that door. He pushed the doors, announcing they would enter as the doors slowly opened, illuminating the space. The group advanced as they moved. Tahan frowned, realizing he couldn't sense any particular presence. Nothing at all. The leader raised his shield in front of him and ordered the group to prepare. It was then that they saw a massive spider hanging from the ceiling, and he shouted that it was the boss at that moment. The swordsman asked if that was the queen spider they had talked about. Relieved, the mage commented that it was good, since the boss was as expected. Then she took her staff and declared she would attack first, conjuring a sphere of sparks and launching it forward. Hitting all the monsters with an electric shock. With a satisfied smile, she clenched her fist, but her eyes soon went wide with shock. The queen spider's body fell to the ground, torn with half of its abdomen missing, something that was clearly not caused by the mage's attack. Seeing this, the group leader became nervous, wondering if the boss was already dead. Realizing something was off, he ordered the group to retreat, but everyone felt a powerful pressure coming from the corpse and wondered what it was. Another leg of the queen fell onto the torn abdomen of the spider. She let out a loud scream, spread her arms, and summoned her army. She was an awaken, a rank B queen, superior that ruled over all kinds of spider monsters, possessed high intelligence, was extremely cunning, and did not reproduce, instead invading the territories of other similar monsters, expanding her army at their expense while sharing her power with her awaken subordinates. She smiled watching the terrified people and then swung her leg to finish them off. However, suddenly a flame emerged in her path. Tahan blocked her strike with a movement of his sword and looked at her, thinking how he never would have expected this monster to appear here. He knew that without skill in swordsmanship, he couldn't even scratch her with just one hit. His sword had already cracked, and he reflected that he needed to deal as much damage as possible with a single attack. Then he lunged, delivering a blow to the monster's abdomen, but his sword broke instantly, causing him to curse in his mind, despite that it left a deep wound on the awaken's abdomen. Before retreating, thinking that with his broken sword he couldn't deliver a fatal blow. At the moment he landed, the queen spider had already raised her leg to attack, but was intercepted by a suddenly appearing sword. Blocking her strike and protecting Tahan, Juno advanced while the guild leader, he focused on buying time to create a new weapon when Juno suddenly felt something strange and shuddered as he looked at himself. He wondered if he had exhausted all his mana, reflecting that it was already incredible he had lasted that long, and pulled out a potion bottle from his pocket. After drinking it, he thought about how the potion could only be used once a day, since excessive use would cause dependency. He tossed the bottle aside, feeling a surge of energy. With a smile, he remarked that the effect had been excellent, while Tahan was deeply worried. In an instant, a sword appeared in front of him. The sword's creator told him to buy time. He thought about how impressive the B-rank boss was. If it hadn't been for the mistake, it should have just been a regular boss. They called her the Spider Queen. Fortunately, she was there because dealing with this monster would have been difficult for them. Not only would the level of danger be that of a B-rank boss, but the level itself was also changing. At that moment, the new Spider Queen swung her leg, striking her opponent. He immediately blocked it by swinging his sword, then began launching quick attacks with a smile, which he quickly countered. Observing them, Juno thought that his raw combat power surpassed that of 5 lower-ranked fighters. As for Araken's ability, it was not possible to rely solely on Tahan. He told the rest of the group to stand up. They needed to be ready to fight. Araken had changed his target. The group leader exclaimed nervously, "Who is he?" The others stood up and asked why such a talented awakener was secretly disguised as an assistant. He turned to them and, pointing at the small spiders approaching, said they had something to deal with first. He waved his hand, creating a weapon, and told them to choose. They could take the weapon in front of them and clear the dungeon by fighting the spiders or run and wait outside until it was all over. Extending his hand toward them, he said he was sure they would make the right decision. After that, the group members picked up their new weapons and joined the battle. The swordsman wielded his sword, easily slicing through the spider's body. Thinking this was incredible, he had never wielded a weapon like that before and swung the sword a few more times. He prevented the spiders from attacking, and seeing the clean cuts on their bodies, he thought it felt like cutting through paper. Suddenly, a loud crack distracted the swordsman from the battle. The mage had used magic, and her staff began to emit electric sparks. She was so fascinated by the sight that she smiled widely. The mage had used magic, and her staff began to emit electric sparks. She was so fascinated by the sight that she smiled widely. She then confidently waved her staff, dropping lightning on the spiders. The team leader was completely astonished. He had thought she had only changed her weapon, but the power of her abilities had increased several times. After the girl's strike, only charred corpses were left on the ground, and the team leader, turning his gaze to Juno, exclaimed in his thoughts, "Who is he?" Meanwhile, the sword of Tan was still intact. He paused after a series of blows and gritted his teeth, thinking this was to be expected from a rank B boss. It was hard to buy time. His opponent grinned widely and then let out a loud shout. Leaning towards him, his body already covered with multiple cuts from his attacks, igniting his sword with flames once again. He thought he needed to end this as quickly as possible, and Araken, seeing the light emitted by his sword, froze for a moment. After that, Tahan lunged forward to attack, but she wouldn't fall so easily. He was faster and delivered a powerful flaming strike, causing her to collapse instantly, then looked at his sword and thought the weapon remained intact. It was better than he had imagined. And suddenly he noticed several small spiders on the ground heading towards the girl, who looked around alarmed and exclaimed, "Where did they come from and where are they going?" The group leader shouted that they were all heading towards the guildmaster. Tahan turned to them and ordered them to fall back. After that, he thought to himself, did she hide the spiders? The situation was serious. Immediately, the spiders completely covered the wound on Araken's body, and Tahan confirmed that she had sacrificed the spiders to restore her health. After that, all the wounds on Araken's head were healed, and she looked at her opponent, then pushed herself up with her hands, helping herself to rise once again. She stood tall over the man, looking at the Spider Queen and the 1,000 little subjects behind her. He said that until everyone was dead, she would keep regenerating, repeatedly activating her ability and launching an attack, thinking she needed to boost her firepower to finish everything in one blow. Suddenly her sword broke, and realizing this, she cursed loudly. At the same time, the protagonist smiled and said it was better than he had imagined, extending his hand forward, creating a weapon once again, and said that although he had created a sword with the remaining mana, he didn't think it would be destroyed. After that, a sword, massive, embedded itself in the ground near Tahan's feet, and the protagonist told her to take it. It wasn't a sword of one hand like the ones she had used before. It was the strongest weapon he could create at that moment. Without saying a word, Tahan placed her hand on the hilt, and as soon as she took the sword, she felt that with this weapon, she could defeat them all in one blow. The blade in her hand ignited immediately in flames, and fiery cracks began to spread from the tip along the ground. She smiled and said she wasn't very familiar with two-handed swords, but it seemed to suit her well. After that, she pulled the sword from the ground, using all her strength to hold it. He gritted his teeth and charged forward as soon as he was close enough, swinging the sword and unleashing a powerful fire blow. Araken got nervous, gritted her teeth, and her face lit up with an explosion of flames that soon engulfed her body. Followed by a deeper explosion, Juno thought the blast was a basic berserker ability. This was probably the first time Tahan had used it fully. A berserker loses control of themselves in exchange for overwhelming power, so he probably hadn't used it before, because it was hard to manage the risk of the weapon breaking while Tahan lowered his sword and stood still. Then flames began to escape from his mouth, followed by a powerful explosion of energy that released all the fire. After that, the flames gradually subsided, and he sighed, thinking it had been dangerous. If he hadn't released all his power, he would have lost his sanity. He looked at his trembling hand and thought this was only the second time it had happened. This since his awakening. He had finally managed to use this ability correctly. Then he looked at Juno, thinking he had made a mistake. Juno wasn't just an ordinary awakened. Once his ability was discovered, everyone would focus on him. This thought unsettled him, and he decided to take another look at the mangled body of Aranke. The protagonist approached and also examined it, noticing the purple energy, thinking there was an incredible amount of mana comparable to none. He turned to Tahan and asked if he felt anything coming from that corpse. Tahan replied that no, it was definitely dead. Its remains had been disposed of, so it was no longer alive. At that moment, the protagonist realized that not even a high-ranking hunter could perceive this mana. So he moved closer, and as he did, his passive ability activated, and the aura began to flow in his body. His magic bar filled completely, and the system notified him that he had currently accumulated 150 mana units out of a total of 100. If the collected magic exceeded the limit, a reward would be granted. He obtained a new ability, demonic weapon production. This was an active ability that consumed 100 mana units accumulated to create weapons from the demonic realm. At that moment, he had no demonic weapons stored. These would be stored once created and could materialize without using additional mana. He could use this ability once a day and thought he couldn't even imagine what a weapon from the demonic realm would be. Although he had no memories of the demonic realm, it could be what he thought. He regretted that the reward was not related to mana, but this wasn't bad at all. Although he had no memories of the demon realm, it could be what he thought. He regretted that the reward was not related to mana, but this wasn't too bad. His magic bar was restored to 50 units, and he thought that thanks to his reaction, he had already obtained half of the required amount. It seemed that the reward ended there when Tahan suddenly interrupted his thoughts. He called him and said he had something to tell him. The protagonist turned to him, asking what was wrong. He replied that he wanted to apologize. He bowed to him and said that despite his refusal, he had still insisted he join the guild. It was rude of him, even as the guild leader. Juno, clearly not expecting this, was slightly surprised, and the man closed his eyes and said that he truly regretted it and wanted to apologize. The protagonist felt uncomfortable and asked what he was doing all of a sudden at that moment. The team leader looked in his direction and nervously wondered what the hell was happening. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the swordsman's voice, which startled him and made him turn around quickly. The man raised his hand with a smile and said it was dangerous, that they had searched everywhere and there was nothing left. The girl walking beside him shared her thoughts, saying that it must have absorbed all the monsters from the dungeon beforehand. The man looked at his disappearing sword and asked, "Isn't this an incredible weapon? It can cut monsters without wasting energy." She agreed with his words and said she had never heard of a warrior capable of doing something like that, so she asked if it was from the guild or Uberkill. Suddenly, the team leader ran towards them and hugged them nervously, urging them to leave so he could contact the association. The man looked worried and confused and asked why they should leave already. The girl agreed with him and said she wanted to thank the guildmaster and the assistant first. The excited leader waved his hands and suggested they quickly leave that disgusting place. At that moment, the swordsman looked confused and replied that they had already understood, so he should stop insisting after that. The team leader led them towards the exit, glancing at the rest of the team while thinking that despite the obvious connection between this assistant and the guild or Uberkill, it would be best for them to leave. If they got involved in the affairs of an important guild, there would be no end to the problems. Juno stepped aside and agreed to talk, saying that although he had used the rental contract, the guild leader shouldn't bow to someone he barely knew. Tahan said the guild would no longer bother him, and of course, he wouldn't either. But that statement didn't mean they had given up. This was their first opportunity. The protagonist crossed his arms over his chest, looking at him distrustfully, but then Tahan extended his hand, offering to make a contract, saying he was sure he would like the terms. A new day arrived, and the protagonist went to the guild or Uberkill building, where he found Mino at the reception. She said she was happy to see him again and introduced herself. Today she would be responsible for handling the contract. Juno thanked her and said the guild leader had mentioned he would contact him immediately. But who would have imagined that it would be the next morning? She replied that the leader had asked her to prepare everything as quickly as possible. He asked where they were now that they had arrived. She replied that this was the special reception room of Uberkill, a highly secure place, so he didn't need to worry about privacy. Then she placed the contract on the table. She asked him to read it. These were the conditions that the leader of the guild had mentioned in the dungeon. It would take some time, but she could modify the content of the contract, so he shouldn't hesitate to say what he thought. The protagonist picked up the contract and read it carefully. Then he thought with a smile that just as he had said in the dungeon, now that everything was resolved, it felt more real. He placed the contract back on the table. He said he had no questions and that they could proceed. While discussing the terms of the contract in the dungeon, Juno had been confused about the guild's support. Tahan clarified that it was not official support, but secret support. Sure, this was just speculation, but he understood. Vaguely, why Tahan didn't want him to join the guild for various reasons. He needed to hide his identity. If he was right, then his suggestion could help. They could secretly provide him with the materials he needed. Equipment, ingredients, door rights, it didn't matter. He just needed to sign a contract as a formality. Everything would be provided in secret, of course. The protagonist asked why they were suddenly so generous. He replied that naturally, it wasn't just out of kindness. He would have to complete missions personally assigned to him. Those were his conditions. But he wouldn't force him. If he didn't like the missions, he could reject them. Juno laughed and asked what would happen if he didn't help but still received their support. He replied that it would be fine. Also, the main point of the contract was to create a bond between the guild and him, preventing him from joining others. Accepting the support was nothing more than a sign of his loyalty. That was all. Suddenly, loud footsteps were heard nearby, and they turned toward the sound. The members of the association rushed toward them. They said they were from the Hunters Association team. In that, one of them approached the guildmaster and asked if he was okay. Realizing it was time to leave, Tahan told Juno that he would listen to his answer outside. He hoped the answer would be affirmative. Finally, he turned and added with a smile that for him, his ability was the best. Reflecting on this, the protagonist picked up a pen and thought that according to his plan, he wanted to leave a lasting impression on Tahan and continue his relationship with the guild or Overkill without joining it. They said they were from the Hunter Association team, and one of them approached the master of the guild and asked if he was okay. Realizing it was time to leave, Tahan told Juno he would hear her answer outside. Hoping the answer would be affirmative, he finally turned and added with a smile that for him, her skill was the best. Reflecting on this, the protagonist picked up a pen and thought that according to his plan, he wanted to leave a lasting impression on Tahan and continue his relationship with the guild, or Overkill without joining it. But for now, this would still be useful. So he signed his name and handed the document to Minu, asking when he would start receiving support. She replied that from now on, he should let her know if he needed anything. She took a small box from her bag and placed it on the table, saying the master of the guild had prepared a gift for him as a memento of the contract. He had heard that he had found something useful in the starting room. Curious, Juno opened the box and mana started to seep in, so he closed it and put it in his backpack, thanking her with a smile. Then he handed her a list of the materials he currently needed and asked when he could receive them. She looked at the list and replied that there were many things, so she thought it would be possible within a week, however, maybe. He was getting involved in something that wasn't his concern, but he felt those materials wouldn't be useful to him. So he got up from the couch, slung the backpack over his shoulders, and replied that he wouldn't use them, he just wanted to give them to someone else. Time passed and he went to the Hunter Association to see someone. He took out his phone and checked the time, thinking that she should have arrived by now. When the girl entered the association, she smiled, thinking that the lower rank hunter, Anya, had finally arrived. The girl with doubt walked to the counter, but in her future memories, she had a completely different personality when fighting monsters and shooting them with arrows, creating huge holes in their bodies. She was very confident in her abilities after the players were selected. This cool hunter was called the Archer Goddess. Now, without looking up from the ground, she approached the counter and turned to the clerk of the association, saying that she wanted to apply for a training pass for the gate. She handed over her identification and with a smile asked if, being a lower rank hunter, she should be given a pass for a D rank gate. She was rejected, and with a shy smile said she would like to obtain a pass for the D rank gate, which surprised the clerk. The man looked at her information on the computer and saw that she had only entered the gate twice. He thought she had been ranked recently as a lower rank hunter, but considering that she had almost no experience and had only entered the gate a few times, he had seen lower rank hunters give up on everything, but not those of lower rank. The guy quickly glanced at Anya, who was filling out the paperwork, and thought she probably had her reasons. But she would soon be downgraded. The first rank of the awakened is based on the amount of mana when the blue energy flows through the cracks. Mana enters all humans, but each absorbs a different amount. The more the body can store, the better a person's abilities, so the association began to calculate how much mana each person had. Those who could control more than a certain amount were called awakened, and then they began to classify them according to the amount of mana. Of course, the rank is not fixed. Even if the rank is low, a hunter can raid dungeons, and if they gain fame within the association, one can be promoted, but of course, the opposite can also happen. At that moment, Anya handed the documents to the girl with a smile and said she had filled everything out. Offering help with the registration, she asked if she had a partner. The excited girl replied that she did not, and said that then she would register her in the partner list according to the rules. It was necessary to conduct raids in pairs, so until now, there hadn't been any. There had been no requests for the degradation door, so she would have to wait a bit. Anya asked if she could go alone, to which the girl replied yes, but only if she had permission to enter alone. However, considering she was registering, she did not have that permission. To obtain it, she needed to pass the test. Anya got nervous and asked her to wait. Then the girl said she needed to tell her something. In a month, she would have a rank update. Anya, about to leave, froze upon hearing those words, and the girl continued saying that she had probably already seen the message. But to confirm her rank, she would need experience cleaning one more D-rank dungeon or passing a rank A test. She thought that the test would be more suitable for her. She would probably receive a message about it soon and hoped to succeed. Anya thanked her excitedly and then left the association, thinking that even requesting a pass for the training door was difficult, so she would have to make an online request. Coming to such a crowded place was crazy. She decided to come because she thought she wouldn't be degraded. She composed herself and, remembering her experience cleaning dungeons, thought it was a D-rank door, so something like that wouldn't happen again. If she hurried, everything would be fine. Suddenly a message arrived on her phone, and nervously, she adjusted her glasses, thinking they had told her she would have to wait for an invitation, but it had already arrived. A new day came, and she approached the D-rank door, walking hesitantly toward the portal and thinking it had been a long time since she dressed like this. It seemed so unusual to her. The protagonist who had become her partner approached and asked for her name, then introduced himself, saying he hoped they would get along. Anya made a slight bow and said it was a pleasure to meet him. He smiled shyly, apologizing for being late. He felt the urge to hurry. She eagerly accepted and said she had made a request, and then spoke with the association staff. At that moment, he thought she was a hunter, who had originally been rank A, but after continuously failing the tests, was one of those who were downgraded to rank C. Despite those conditions, she received the title of Archer Goddess, because after becoming a player, she discovered a talent within herself, and he knew what kind of talent that was. It was a talent that could be discovered within oneself even without being a player, and today he wanted to awaken it in her. They entered the dungeon and found themselves in a forest in the middle of the mountains where goblins roamed freely. A small group of goblins patrolled the area. Anya, hiding behind the bushes, discreetly spied and thought they were gone. They are really monsters, thank goodness I decided to buy this. She looked at the bracelet and thought it was gear that detected mana. From the monsters, she turned to her companion and apologized, saying she would go alone. She asked him if he could handle the killing alone, promising to give him all the loot and compensate him for everything. He crouched in response and told her not to worry, that if she needed help to just let him know he could at least make arrows. She stood up, thanked him, tensed the arrow on the bowstring, and aimed, telling herself mentally that everything was fine, that she didn't need to worry finding the right moment. She released the arrow that left a magical glow in its wake. Then she approached the goblin, and when it turned, the arrow struck its head. The second goblin moved quickly out of the line of attack and grabbed his bow to shoot back behind them. There was an explosion caused by the arrow hitting something. Pulling back on the bowstring, Anya shot another arrow but missed Juno. For his part, watched her and thought that he had never seen her fight before. Becoming a player, her raw, destructive power was much greater than that of a rank A, but it was useless if she couldn't aim at that moment. Anya shot another arrow and made a hole in one of the monster's bodies, then thought that one of the 3 arrows had hit the target. That was her record. This way she could kill at least 4 more monsters. She needed to finish everything with 2 shots just when she was about to shoot another arrow. Suddenly she stopped, noticing that one of the goblins was blowing a horn, alerting the others of the danger. She didn't immediately understand what that meant, But then the goblins appeared in the clearing, and feeling the pressure from all sides, she froze in place. Her bracelet beeped, warning of danger, and looking around, she realized she was surrounded. She was confused and nervously thought, where should I shoot, forward or backward? What should I do at that moment? The goblins behind her decided to attack. But suddenly an intense light appeared in front of her, many swords embedded in the ground holding them back so they wouldn't advance. Juno walked toward Anya, smiling and saying that he needed her help. She exclaimed in surprise, asking if he hadn't said he was a rank creator. He replied, yes. And then his sword began to dissolve. He said it wouldn't last long, so he needed her help. She turned to him and asked what she should do. He pointed to the monsters hiding behind the bushes and told her to shoot there with all her remaining strength. She agreed and aimed again, thinking that she didn't know what he was planning, but she would do what he asked after that. He shot an arrow that flew at the speed of light, destroying everything in its path, and warned his companion about the shot. He asked what they should do next. He took her hand and said that with his shot, he had cleared the way. Now they needed to run. At that moment, the monsters charged at them, and she was very surprised to see him run. He pulled her along, and soon they distanced themselves from the monsters. They found themselves at the entrance of a cave. Anya caught her breath and wiped the sweat from her face, saying they had survived. Then she thought about where they were and wondered if they had gotten rid of the goblins. She remembered looking back while they were running through the forest. She had a feeling that they wouldn't be able to escape. So much had happened that she couldn't comprehend it. She looked at her companion, who was illuminating the cave with a flashlight, and thought to herself, why is he so calm? They needed to get out of there quickly. She shyly smiled and said that she was done for the day. She would pay the compensation she had mentioned. He replied that they couldn't leave yet. They were worried, so they would stay there for a while. It was too dangerous now. It seemed they had left a trail while running, so they had no choice but to wait for the goblins to get further away. She exclaimed when they could leave then. He turned to her and replied that it could take until noon, but depending on the situation, it could take longer. Hearing this, she shuddered and then held her head, exclaiming noon, deciding that they were lost. She knelt in despair, and he scratched the back of his head, thinking that, of course, he was lying. They would be far away in about 30 minutes, and the goblins' pursuit wasn't that strong. It was a pathetic reason, but at this point, it seemed Anya would believe anything. She looked again at the cave entrance and thought that this was because she needed to force her to enter the cave with him. While reflecting on this, she closed her eyes and crossed her arms over her chest, then imagined seeing her run out, running from the cave in panic, and thought she doubted that she would accept. Suddenly, her thoughts were interrupted by Anya's guilty voice. She stood up, made a small bow, and apologized, saying that all of this was her fault. If she had known how to fight, if she had gone alone from the start, none of this would have happened. She felt terrible about it all, nervously gripping her weapon with her hands and thinking that once again, she had caused trouble, even as a low-rank fighter. She shouldn't have even tried. She started to cry and gritted her teeth, telling herself that she shouldn't have come. Juno reached out to her and snapped his fingers in front of her face, distracting her from those thoughts. He said that if she felt guilty, then he would let her do something for him and that he needed her to pull herself together. She hesitated and asked what the request would be. He turned to the cave and said they had plenty of time, then looked at her with a smile and added that he would explain everything in detail. After that, they entered the cave together and began to move forward, illuminating the path with the flashlight. Anya hesitated and asked if she really needed to help him. She was rank A, but didn't have much experience in dungeons. She even didn't understand what he meant by an elite monster. He smiled, remembering that he had said. This was her first time at a training gate, and he said he now understood because he didn't know. It wasn't common knowledge. Instead of bosses, there was an elite monster of a lower rank living in that cave. For personal reasons, he needed to defeat that monster. But until now, he had been rejected and hadn't even been able to fight it. That's why she was the first to accept him as support for her team upon hearing this. She shrank back and remained silent, and he looked at her, wondering if that sounded strange, gathering his determination. She pressed her lips together and then stopped, saying confidently that she would help him if he didn't mind. Remembering the goblins in the forest, she thought helping him was the right decision. Thanks to him, she had been saved. She also knew how painful it was not to be accepted into a team. She needed to help him. Suddenly, her bracelet beeped. At that moment, a loud sound of footsteps was heard, and she got nervous. The protagonist illuminated the area in front of them, and a huge goblin with a club in hand appeared before them. It was the elite monster. Anya immediately stepped forward and tensed the string of her bow. Telling Juno to move aside, she thought that even though the monster was illuminated, it was still a rank monster, and if she hit it, At least once, it would die. Her arrow was wrapped in magical chains, and then she shot it, seeing that the arrow followed the correct trajectory. She was glad about her success, but suddenly the goblin covered itself with the club, and the arrow passed through it. Leaving her stunned by the impact, the goblin's leg slipped back. She thought it deflected the arrow. She was wrong. She needed to shoot with all her strength. She drew the string again, but when she tried to release it, her body didn't respond, and her fingers refused to let go of the arrow's tip. Her hands trembled, and she thought nervously, why now? She needed to shoot. Hearing the loud sound again, she focused her attention on the monster. Watching it charge towards them while swinging its club, she froze in fear. Suddenly, the protagonist grabbed her and threw her back, causing her to fall. Then he moved forward. Right after that, a loud noise was heard, and dust rose. The monster had struck the ground with its club with all its strength. Looking at the cloud of dust in confusion, he called Juno. He remembered being in the dungeon without finding himself in a similar situation. A girl from his team exclaimed, "What is he doing? This is a joke. She can't even shoot properly." And when she did, it was in his direction. She almost died because of him. How is he going to make it up to her? Anya asked him to wait, and said that even though she had missed the target, she hadn't tried to shoot her. The girl smiled sarcastically and angrily asked him. He doesn't apologize but makes excuses, thinking just because he's a rank A, the world is at his feet. Soon he will find out who he's messing with. After coming out of the dungeons, Anya was rejected from the team, and other hunters began to whisper, wondering if she was the rank a loser they had heard almost killed. Someone in the dungeons and couldn't even kill a weak monster. Someone called her an idiot and said that's why even rank A teams rejected her. Another hunter asked what she was doing with her talent. What a waste. If she was like this, why did she still want to be a hunter? Coming out of her memories, she looked at the monster with a dark expression and thought she should have given up on everything because of him. Even Juno had gotten hurt. At that exact moment, the goblin raised its club above its head, ready to strike, but suddenly a bright spark flew between them, and Juno said he was really bad at acting. His sword easily blocked the elite monster's attack. Anya, realizing this, called out to him in surprise, and he said loudly that he knew it sounded nonsensical, but he needed her to listen carefully. If she calmed down and just did what he said, then they could definitely win. She frowned and thought she had prepared everything in case of emergency. She could activate it without problems. All that was left was to buy time. She continued swinging her sword, attacking, and told him to look closely at that idiot so he would see something and should hit that mark with all his strength. But Anya was no longer listening to him. Her body trembled and began to stand up, wondering what that feeling was. Her senses sharpened. It was very uncomfortable, but she could see everything. Her eyes shone as she tensed the arrow again, thinking that now she could see clearly where she aimed. She drew the arrow and focused completely, closed her eyes, and then opened them wide, thinking that with this single arrow everything would be resolved. She aimed and released the arrow, which left a bright light in the air. The goblin froze in place, hearing the whistle it made. The protagonist declared that fortunately, it seemed everything had activated correctly, but for some reason, the activation conditions were very strict. Then the elite monster extended its club towards the arrow to protect itself from the blow, but the arrow pierced both the weapon and the monster, leaving a large hole in its body. Seeing this, Juno smiled, thinking it was worth it, while Anya was surprised and confused at the same time. Just after that, an explosion occurred. The severed limb of the monster fell to the ground from the impact, and the creature itself began to lose its balance. Before finally collapsing, Anya kept gasping, while the protagonist explained that at first, it would feel strange. However, he said that she had probably never felt her senses amplified before anyway. He had resorted to some extreme methods for her to understand that feeling and realize her potential. Despite that, Anya was still confused and asked how he knew all this was going to happen. She also asked what he meant by her potential. He smiled and told her to take her time. They had plenty of it. She approached him and in an irritated tone, asked him not to change the subject and to answer the question. But before she could finish speaking, suddenly she felt a sharp pain, grabbed her head, and then lost consciousness. The protagonist had to carry her on his back to the exit sign, gasping and saying that making friends was really hard. But at least one thing was resolved. Just when they exited the cave, she woke up and the first thing she did was apologize, saying she didn't know why she had acted that way, that she felt like she wasn't herself. She couldn't believe she had shown such disrespect to the man who had saved her twice. She was truly sorry for doubting him and apologized for fainting so suddenly. He looked confused by her apology, then touched his forehead wearily, saying it was fine, that no one had been hurt, and they had defeated all the monsters, so she needed to pull herself together as half an hour had already passed. She nodded with tears in her eyes, and he asked her if she could give him the pendant she had given him before they entered the cave. She remembered and reached into her pocket to hand it over to him. He examined the pendant closely and noticed that the color of the crystal had changed. She had definitely used it. The perception meteorite was a rare object that could only be obtained in Lamas Moras of rank A, called the Nest of the Blazing Squirrel. This object had a skill called Sharp Senses that activated automatically when certain conditions were met. For example, when someone shot an arrow at the head of the bearer of this pendant, their senses became extremely sharp, enhancing their abilities and allowing them to use superhuman perception. He returned the amulet to her, and thought that the problem lay in the difficult conditions for its activation. The emotions of the bearer had to be at their peak. For people like Anya, the best way to activate it was through intense fear. So he had made her feel unbearable fear. It seemed difficult, but he had managed to awaken her, although at a high price. There were very few of these pendants on the market, and he had already given up on getting one, but he thought that he would find one in 2 days. And thanks to him, everything had become much easier. But this was just the beginning. Ania only felt like she was awakening because of the object. She would need more practice to reach her original level. Her expression turned serious, and she told him to listen carefully. Her first task was to ensure that her concentration was completely focused on the monsters. To do this, she first needed to change her bow. She was strong enough to switch from a short bow to a long one and shoot from a distance. Naturally, she wouldn't need to fight the monsters up close, which would make her feel less afraid of them. She wanted to tell him something more, but she didn't let him finish, and simply thanked him. He didn't understand why she was thanking him, and she said she was grateful for everything, including the pendant. When she thought she was going to die there, she felt something coming from it, as if everything around her had frozen, as if she could do anything. She saw where she was aiming, and the target was perfectly aligned with the monster. To be honest, even though her character's range was lower in terms of everything else, she was no more than one, and the more she tried to change that, the more disappointed she felt. But she had the feeling that during this short time together, she had grown a lot. She felt capable, she felt she could do anything, and for the first time she allowed herself to go with it. Realizing she had said too much, she got worried, but he smiled and told her it wouldn't be easy for her alone. He would give her his number so she could call him. If she needed anything, she was very happy and thanked him, then said she would also leave her number. When Juna was about to give him her number, she noticed a message from Taehan asking her to call quickly. Because there was an emergency, she decided she would contact him once they left the dungeons after a while. As soon as he and Anya exited the dungeons, he called Taehan, who thanked him, and said he would return the call after the meeting. Juno smiled and said she would help if she could. The last time Taehan had given her something very useful, Hajan responded that he was glad it had been helpful, and that he was happy Juna had accepted to help him. After that, he hung up the phone, put it in his pocket, and looked out the window. When he heard a knock at the door, Jesus entered the office and said that the president of the association had returned and they could leave shortly. Soon after, the two arrived at the association building and walked down the hallway, but Jesus was restless, commenting that the situation was very unusual, that normally he would have sent an official document. Who would have imagined that the president of the association would summon him? He had been sending difficult orders through documents, but if he had called personally, maybe the exit rank would have shown up again. Tahan replied that it was fine that Jano had accepted to help him, and that if he fought like before, there would be no danger. He thought with a satisfied smile that he had done well to establish a working relationship with Juno. Jesus, on the other hand, was worried, thinking that he seemed more excited than he was after the dungeon, probably all because of that creator. Had been acting strangely since the unlimited support. Who would have thought the guildmaster would make such a surprising offer? She knew that berserkers struggled to control their emotions, but the guildmaster was calculating and sensible. Could Juna be more capable than she had imagined? But she immediately dismissed that idea, thinking that a rank could not create a weapon that he truly liked. He rarely invited him, so he needed to discover everything in person. Noticed her suspicious gaze, and then the two arrived at the president's office door. The guard outside greeted him, asking if he was alone. Tahan was a bit surprised by the question, and asked if someone else was supposed to come. The guard replied that from what he heard, 2 guild leaders were expected if they were alone. He couldn't wait. Tahan asked if he could know who the other leader was. The man noticed someone behind them and then pointed forward with a smile, saying that Jack, the leader of the guild Sima, had already arrived, appeared behind them, and upon noticing Tahan, exclaimed in surprise upon hearing his voice. Tahan and his secretary immediately turned, and he waved in greeting, saying he had heard Tahan had been very busy lately. Tahan remained silent while Jesu frowned, thinking that this was the only person who irritated the guild leader. He gave a fake smile and said he didn't expect to see him there. Tahan slightly furrowed his brow, holding back his anger towards the guild master. Sinma approached and asked who this was, and if he wasn't the foolish guild leader. Aok declared to Tahan remained silent, thinking about how annoying it was, mocking Aok. He said he was wrong after all. It wasn't the guild. The problem was the leader. Tahan said he was too busy to respond to his absurd provocations. Said he must be busy picking more low-level girls, comforting himself by getting novices to admire him. Mocked. EU didn't like that and asked what he was trying to say. Aok asserted that it seemed true, since he hadn't gone to those dungeons to save anyone. After all, he had tried to clear a dungeon, and was misclassified. She was shocked, and Tahan placed a hand on her shoulder, telling her not to respond to that. She wanted to object, but didn't. Turned to the guard and said they would go in. Then he opened the doors and spoke to the president of the association, that the guild leaders Aok and Singwa were already there. Manan replied that he already knew, that he could hear their discussions from there. He smiled and added that they never changed. Shortly after, both entered, and Jesu stayed outside, glanced at the girl sitting next to him, a bit hesitant, and offered her tea, but she politely declined, saying he was fine while the two leaders of Guild Tahan and AOQ were sitting in front of Chamanan. He looked at them and said there was an urgent task for their guilds that needed to be completed immediately. 3 days ago, an unspecified door appeared on the outskirts of the city. Explorers were sent to investigate it, but none of them returned. Tahan frowned and asked if that door was a false door. Chamanan responded that, as he had mentioned, the door was undefined, and even measuring its mana was extremely difficult. Aok exclaimed, confused, trying to understand the situation. Tahan thought it was strange that the door couldn't even be evaluated since there were normally tools for that purpose. The rank of a door was generally determined by 2 factors. First, the amount of mana inside the door was measured using a special tool that allowed determining the door's rank. Normally, the rank of the door corresponded to the rank of the monsters inside. Second, the intelligence data sent by the association to assess the situation was compared. Chamanan stated that, as they already knew, false rank dungeons arose when the amount of mana inside suddenly increased. However, this time it was impossible to measure it. Tahan asked if they had tried sending more explorers, and he confirmed that they had done so several times, but none of the explorers returned. Aok placed his hands behind his head in frustration and asked, irritated, if they had no information about the dungeon's rank or what it contained. He suspiciously questioned if the association was trying to divert blame for what had happened. The president of the association replied, explaining that they didn't know how long the veil of the unknown rank door would last if they didn't act soon. It was very likely that monsters would start coming out of the door. He reminded them that this had happened in the past, and every time it occurred, it turned into a total disaster. Then, with a serious expression, he added that he understood how his words could seem pressuring, but this was truly an emergency, and this time refusals would not be accepted. He wanted the guilds or Uberkill to join forces to clear the undefined door. He would have liked to send the Guild of Flame as well, but they couldn't participate due to a sudden mission abroad. This situation was serious enough to bring together the 3 largest guilds. He set a 2-day deadline for preparations, stating that he would provide funding and the best possible reward for completing the mission. Of course, if they needed anything, he would assist them as much as possible. Reflecting on what he had said, Tahan asked if the cleanup team should consist only of guild members. Chamanan responded that it didn't matter. Since the existence of that door was causing chaos and panic in society, he could only allow that a small number of trustworthy individuals would participate in the mission. After seeing the reaction of, Tahan looked at him with a slightly surprised expression, then smiled weakly, his confidence evident, and said he understood everything. After that, Ak returned to his guild and, throwing his jacket to a subordinate, ordered them to gather, a team of guild members ranked A or higher, and select those who would be available in the next 2 days. Remembering Tahan's smile, he thought that crafty guy definitely had something planned. What was that smile? It was so annoying, definitely. He would take this opportunity to crush him. Irritated, he ordered that Huracan be included in the team, which surprised his subordinates, insisting that she must be invited without fail. The subordinates, upon hearing the order, became nervous, surprised that the leader was demanding the presence of a girl who usually refused to help anyone. The excited girl said that given her personality, she would definitely refuse. To which Aok firmly replied that they should do everything possible to ensure she showed up, and warned that if she didn't, they should be prepared to switch roles. The frightened guild members quickly confirmed their understanding and dispersed to carry out the order. Still frustrated, Aok headed to the elevator, thinking that Huracan usually didn't help anyone, but he planned to take advantage of the situation and recruit her 2 days later. The first part of the team, made up of members of the guild or Uberkill, gathered at the door. A girl named Jane asked what time it was since the others had not yet arrived. A classman said there were 5 minutes left until the scheduled meeting time. They were always punctual. Clearly expressing her displeasure, she spun her weapon in her hand and said she couldn't stand those idiots. They had no manners. Her expression hardened as she asked if they would learn anything if she shot them in the head. The man, outraged by her words, gave her a smack on the head, telling her to watch what she said. She held her head in pain and said he was brutally strong. He approached her in a threatening manner and asked what she had said. After that, she began to run, and he chased her. Juno, observing the scene, commented to Tahan that the members of his guild got along very well. Tahan replied that although it seemed that way, they were very reliable in battle. He was grateful that Juno had agreed. To be honest, he thought she would refuse. The protagonist smiled slightly and said he had used the item Tahan had given him. He was also proud of it, directing his attention to the guild members who had already started fighting. He thought that of course this wasn't the only reason. He had a mission, a secret that would take place in a dungeon with a story there he needed to put an end to the abandoned world and receive rewards. The dungeon opening time was 168 hours. Additionally, the mission window had coordinates unknown and rewards written on it. 5 days ago, this system window with a secret mission appeared, something that only a small number of players received. Suddenly before him, the selection of players had not yet begun, but he had already received the secret mission, so he saw no reason to decline it. Even though these missions had very high difficulty levels, if he completed them, he could receive incredible rewards, some even awakening new abilities. Who would have thought it would be the same dungeon? Zoe's voice distracted him from his thoughts, and he looked at her, finding her serious gaze. She apologized in advance for that idiot's rudeness, and then he heard Y's voice saying they were arriving a bit early. The vice leader and Joey immediately stopped fighting. Tahan stepped forward while apologizing to them, saying they had a lot of work. They understood that, but it seemed like the guild or Overkill, he had too much free time. Upon reaching the meeting place with his team, he said with a sarcastic smile that they had been clearing low-rank doors, and because of that, she got really irritated. But the man who stopped her asked her not to respond and to ignore them. She wanted to object and was about to insult them, but he silenced her immediately and asked her again to ignore them. At that moment, Juno stayed at a distance, thinking that the guilds of Overkill and Sino were still on bad terms. It wasn't just an emotional rivalry between the guilds, but also a public dispute over which was stronger. Noticing a new face among the Overkill members, he observed Juno and laughed, asking if it was his trump card. Then he declared they had acted as if they had something, but in the end, it was just him. His laughter turned to anger, and he sighed heavily, saying they had gone too far. Clearing the dungeon was a joke to them. They wanted to be taken out of there. The protagonist remained silent and called them fools. A girl from his team smiled and told him to stop getting angry, saying they also had a new member in their team, a girl named Kuran. She appeared behind them, and with a displeased expression, reminded them they had said they were short on time. She didn't think they had time to discuss, so they needed to hurry. She stepped forward, and upon seeing her, Juno stepped back in horror, wondering what kind of composition this was. The strongest elemental master in Korea, capable of using the 6 elements, Kuran, a rank S sorceress, and their guild leader, Jung Tahan, really had such a stellar team. She stayed silent about Juno, as she didn't know his abilities. Then she sighed with a smile and said it would be easy. She would be glad to take care of all this. After that, they headed toward the door, and Juno thought it wouldn't be easy in his previous life. The attempt to clear this dungeon had failed. Out of 18 members only, John had survived. Mainly due to his infiltration skill after that, the doors suddenly disappeared, being an unprecedented case where all the high-ranking among the awakened were declared missing. The association worked tirelessly to find any information, but nothing was discovered about the dungeon. There was no guarantee they would succeed this time. But after being in the dungeon for a while, everything turned out to be the opposite of what they expected. Their opponents, the puppets, were so weak that the battle was incredibly easy for them. This made Juno nervous, who wondered why everything was so easy. Some time ago, a portal with a shining ring had lit up at the grand entrance of the dungeon. Here he commented that the mansion was really cool, and Monjin told him to be quiet. The whole team was walking inside the dungeon when Monjin heard a strange sound coming from the portal and turned around. There he saw the door closing violently, and the others turned upon hearing the sound. He tried to open the door, but nothing happened, so he suggested to break it down. The man shouted that he wanted to destroy the door, and then they began to try to break through it. He counted loudly from 1 to 3, and the others hit the door hard. They were surprised and asked what was happening since the door didn't even move. Dissatisfied, the man told everyone to step back because he would do it himself. However, he didn't have time to try, as at that moment strange noises were heard behind him. He turned and saw several creepy puppets attacking him, wondering what those creatures were. With his blow, the puppets broke into pieces and the rest of the team also began to fight the monsters. Their attacks were especially powerful, and he wondered how those creatures dared to attack them when they were so weak. A girl called him, telling him he could use his skill. However, he replied that it was fine, that it wasn't necessary to use a skill for something so trivial. But shortly after, the girl screamed for the leader to turn around. Because the monsters were reanimating behind him, the puppets began to reassemble their bodies with the help of mana. He smiled maliciously, noticing that his resurrection ability was activating. At least that ability would be interesting to see. So he threw a punch, and 2 huge manifestations appeared at his side. The puppets continued their attack, but he started smashing them, fiercely beating them with his magical fists, which trapped them between blows. The rest of the team also fought against monsters using guns. Juno Yen from Team J killed the dummies by slicing them to pieces with his spear. At that moment, only Juno and Yuran remained on the sidelines. He asked if she wasn't going to fight, but Yuran asked him the same question. He explained that he was only support. Haran said it wasn't necessary for her to fight, and that he didn't want to exert himself for a team like that. He observed the powerful flames unleashed by Taehan, who swung his flaming sword, igniting the dummies as they melted. Haran said he was interested in seeing Korea's strongest awakeners in action. He wasn't impressed by the guild leader's fire and commented that everyone seemed ordinary. They couldn't even kill a single monster. If he had known this would happen, he would have turned down the mission at that moment. Juno looked at the dummies and their shining threads. He found it strange. The contaminated man and those monsters weren't in their usual form. He noticed that every movement of the dummies was accompanied by a movement of the threads. Looking up at the ceiling, he saw the source of the threads. All the mana was connected to that artifact. He just had to destroy the object, but he didn't want to reveal his true abilities. He then thought he could use the agreement and everything would be fine. He didn't have time to act because he got distracted by Haran, who killed a nearby insect using a magic crystal. The protagonist looked closely and asked if she had enough mana to use on insects. Why didn't she use it to attack the threads above? She pointed at the fly and asked if he hadn't already given the reason. The insect was incinerated in a swarm of lightning, and Uran replied that he killed whoever he wanted. Juno thought while looking at the ashes of the insect that maybe it wasn't necessary to investigate further. He began to create something and said that maybe Uran was afraid of insects. After making that assumption, he started to form something with mana. She replied that she wasn't afraid of those things and that besides, he should stop talking to her because he was bothering her. Juno apologized and said he didn't want to intrude, but there was also an insect up there. She created a shield with a spider by her side. Haran said that was annoying and prepared to attack with fire. She immediately withdrew the shield and unleashed a massive and powerful stream of fire over the massive threads. A gigantic fireball destroyed everything, and Haran was confused. One of the dummies stopped moving, and at that moment, Aok attacked another dummy. Then he thought, why that annoying Uran was using her abilities there, but suddenly felt something strange and looked at the dummy. He lifted it by the head and asked what was happening. Why weren't they being resurrected? More annoyed, he squeezed the monster's head and said that finally, it had heated up, but in the end, the weak monsters couldn't do anything. The wall broke and glowed with intense mana. Juno walked towards it and began to absorb the mana. He realized that was the source of the resurrection of the dummies. If he hadn't noticed the contaminated mana, he would have never found the origin. So he assumed that might have been the reason why the dungeon cleaning had gone so wrong.